We are going to begin a unit on poetry that will last throughout the rest of the year. We'll be continuing to revisit and look at some different poems. Before we actually look at poems, I like to do just a little review of some different elements of poetry. I know growing up, poetry was not something that was my favorite. I always had a very difficult time writing it, and I've come to appreciate it as I've gotten older. So hopefully I can pass that along to you. I really like this quote. I remember in school when my teacher would make me write a poem, it was always very frustrating, and I think this is why. It says, "A man doesn't go in search of a poem, the poem must come to him." So I almost feel like you need a little bit of inspiration to write a poem. It's not something that can be done on demand. And I will ease those worries. We're not going to do a whole lot of writing of poetry, but we are going to look at and analyze lots of poems. So in looking at poetry, we need to kind of look at what differentiates it from regular writing. So regular writing we call prose. Prose is the written or spoken language in its ordinary form, the way we normally look at writing, in sentences and paragraphs. That's what we're used to. Poetry takes that and changes it into a special genre of literature, and it expresses ideas, feelings. It can also tell a story, but it uses a very different and specific form. Poems are written in lines and stanzas, and there's no one way that it has to be written, as we'll look at, but it is very differently organized, so lines and stanzas. So as we look at an example here, if I was looking at this story or this or informational article about ice cream, you can see that it's written, it's indented here, it's got different sentences, it's focused to one main topic, but it's written differently from this poem here. You can see here, each line here isn't even a complete sentence. There's no period here. You don't actually see a period until you get halfway through the poem. You can see that it's not indented. It's kind of centered along the middle of the paper. And again, so it's just organized very differently. As we look at poems, we're going to look through 5 different elements: form of a poem, the sound elements within a poem, imagery, figurative language, and speaker. And each of these elements has some different terminology that you need to be familiar with, because we're going to be using it to write about these poems as well. So this screencast is going to focus on form. When we look at a form, we look at the way the poem looks on the page. Now, if you don't have your notes out in front of you, you need to pause the screencast right now and go get them. They're in your interactive notebook. We glued them in there. And you're going to be taking notes as I go through the screencast. So you need to find where it says number 1, form, the way a poem looks on the page. And as I go through the notes, you're filling in the blanks. So we've already kind of talked about how it looks different. It might be centered on the page. It's not really written in indenting and paragraph form. So what does form mean? We can talk about a poem being free verse, meaning it has no consistent pattern. One stereotype I think we think with poetry is that it has to rhyme. So free verse poetry tends to have no pattern that the author really could think of. I always just think it's the author just writing his feelings down just as they come into his mind. To make a poem structured, I feel like it takes a little bit more work, because you have to organize some information. You've got to think about, what pattern do I want? Do I want a rhyme pattern? Do I want a pattern with the number of words within each line? Do I want a pattern that has a number of syllables per line? Maybe a number of lines per stanza. And so there's lots of different ways that we can look at patterns. When I think of a poem being in structured form, I think that I see 2 different distinct patterns that the author has created. And that's not always going to be true either, but we'll look at a couple examples and you'll get to kind of decide and justify your thinking. So when we think of structured, the poem could be written to make a picture. I've seen a poem that was about shoes, and it was written in the words made the shape of a high-heeled shoe. The poem could have some pattern that goes with rhythm or rhyme, and we'll talk about what this rhyme scheme means later. Maybe the number of lines are grouped into stanzas, so you'll see 4 lines together and then a space. and then 4 lines together, and then a space, and the whole poem is set up in that kind of pattern, then we would say that it has some type of structure. It's not an accident that the author was, or that the poem was written that way. The author intended it. He wrote his poem to look in that way, so it's structured. When we talk about groupings of stanzas in particular, we can use 3 different terms, and actually you could go up to as I'm sure that there are terms that go up to 10 or 20. The most common, though, that we'll look at are couplets, when you have stanzas that are set up with 2 lines together, triplets, where 3 lines are set together, and quatrains, where 4 lines are set up together. So if we ever see poems set up that way, I'm going to ask you, well, what kind of a pattern does this stanza have? I would expect you to say, well, it's written in couplets or triplets or quatrains, depending on the number of stanzas. Now, if it's written anything more than that, you would just say, well, I've noticed that all of the stanzas have 5 lines in them. We're not going to go above 4 lines in our terminology. So again, if we look at this poem, it's about flowers, and you can see that all the way around it are different adjectives and nouns that have to do with flowers, and it's written to look like a flower. That's not an accident. The author intended it to look that way. He planned that shape out. Over here, this one I would say is free verse. We can see that the stanzas don't always have the same number of lines in them. It says, I don't talk, my lips part and air pushes out. But the sound must not fit because my thoughts are so big. So I don't try to talk. My thoughts must be too good for words, for the air, for my lips. But they are just right for paper. My thoughts flow on paper. They're just big enough. So I don't talk. I compose, I write, I dream. As I read that poem, you don't hear any repetition of rhyme. There's not a rhythm or a pattern that you can kind of tap your foot to. So that poem looks like it's written in free verse. A tree house, a free house, a secret you and me house, a high up in the leafy branches, cozy as can be house, a street house, a neat house, be sure and wipe your feet house, is not my kind of house at all. Let's go live in a tree house. When you look at that poem, you can see a couple of different patterns. You hear a rhythm the way the poem is read. You can see that the lines are written, the stanzas are quatrains, that there are 4 lines in each of the stanzas. You see some repetition of words in the very last word of the first 2 words, and the last word of each stanza is the same. So the author intended it to be that way. We would say that this poem is structured.